Good morning. We're going to officially begin our with a call to order and roll call.
Chairwoman Clark,
Here.
Vice Chair Foley, Superintendent Hoffman,
Here.
Member Burke, Member Canto,
Here.
Member Castro, Member Durando,
Here.
Member Hamilton, Member Hart,
Here.
Member McMillie,
Here.
Member Reff,
Here.
Member Vickman,
Here.
Member Wellborn,
Present.
and Member Yanez.
Here.
And just so you know, we do have two members on the phone, and that will be Member Burke and I believe Member Castro. So you do have a quorum.
Thank you. All right, we'll begin with item number 1 on the agenda, which is a call to the public. I believe we have some public comments.
We do. Madam Chair and members, first up is Julian Robbins.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for letting us speak with you today. My name is Dr. Julene Robbins. I'm the president of the Arizona Association of School Psychologists, and there are several of us here today representing ASP, and we're here to just share some of our thoughts regarding your work, the work of this committee on understanding the concern raised by all educators in Arizona regarding early literacy interventions for students in primary grades. ASP has an ongoing concern for the use of group achievement testing in young students as a determination factor for retention decisions. The National Reading Conference Policy Brief that was published in the Journal of Literacy Research in 2005 suggests that the use of high-stakes testing or group assessments have presented significant liabilities for students. These include the fact that there's no research out there published that actually correlates in any way increases in reading achievement following group assessment in any way. High stakes or group achievement tests are limited in their ability to describe, and I believe someone mentioned this last time on your committee, describe reading achievement in a good way. These high stakes tests cannot answer the question about why students could be showing progress in curriculum benchmark testing, but continue to show poor progress on group achievement testing. High-stakes tests may be harmful to students with regard to self-esteem and motivation. Struggling students whose least preferred activity at school may be reading may shorten their effort or attention to testing in a group administration or a computer-administered test, again, minimizing the accuracy of the scores that we obtain from them. As well, the testing process itself is traumatic to students who know that their skills are already weak. High-stakes tests and constrict the reading curriculum. It is important to note that no group test can fully reflect the full range of reading skills that we are asking that be required, and these are acquired best through good instruction and growth measured by individually administered curriculum benchmark testing as opposed to group assessment. Additionally, group testing is sampling attention and listening comprehension, problem solving, computer skills, all important skills for children for doing well on assessment and learning in general, but do not have anything to reflect for us specifically in reading achievement. High-stakes tests demand significant allocation of time and money that's better used in a variety of other ways, and high-stakes test prep takes a significant amount of time out of instruction time for students. So that instruction time is much more likely to change reading and achievement than the use of practicing and doing group assessment. So for this reason, Arizona's reliance on group assessment scores rather than benchmark testing is problematic in problem solving for students struggling in reading achievement. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Next up is Lisa Persinger.
Greetings. Thanks for hearing us. I'm Dr. Lisa Persinger. I'm a school psychologist. I represent the Arizona Association of School Psychologists in the northern region, north of Maricopa. kind of everywhere else out there. And I'm here for the same reason. I was listening to your notes or your conversation last time, because I do that in my free time. And I heard you talking about the issue of, I really do, I swear. It's when I don't want to read anymore, then I listen. And I heard you talking about the issue with cut scores and the issue with literacy achievement in our state. And we got to talking about it. And I know that I don't envy your job at all. I think you've got a tremendous challenge. And as school psychologists, we appreciate the work that you do and the other ad hoc committees and the full board, because it's a tough job. There are things that I'm hoping that you look at. What we've noticed in the field in our practice is when the cut score was implemented to begin with and we had the move on when reading started, we saw an increase in the number of referrals we were getting at third grade, with parents and teachers panicking that those kids wouldn't pass, knowing that special education was one of the way to move those children forward. And there is an assumption, I think, that we run into, that kids that aren't achieving have a disability, and that's why they're not achieving. And I know that you know that that's probably not true in all of these cases. And I would encourage you to look at your own data. I wish that I had before I came here, and then I could give you this answer. But what is the referral rate pre-move on when reading and post-move on when reading? Not just the number of kids in special ed, but the number of kids tested. And I can tell you that the more we test, the more we place, because of identifying learning disabilities is, there's a lot of debate even about how to do that. It's a challenge for us. It's a challenge for schools, teachers, parents. But I would encourage you to look at that data. The other thing that this might not be popular, but the other thing that I was thinking about is we have had such a shortage of teachers in our state that I have seen the board take action to make it easier to become a teacher and to retain your certification. So here we've lowered standards to become a teacher, and we want to talk about raising standards for our student achievement. And any action that you take, and then all the other ad hoc committees that are working on different issues, your work affects each other. And so somehow you need to be able to have data across these issues to see what their cumulative impact is when you're making these. This is just tough, and you go. The other thing, I have a whole list of things I'm supposed to read, but the gist of it is we've got a lot of research, and I'm going to focus on one at the end. We've got solutions that we know work, and we've got research that tell us that retention as an intervention is not an effective one. What usually happens to those kids is that they may do better that year that they're retained, but what happens is their problem continues to persist, and the gap between them and peers grows later, and they're more likely to drop out. Gosh darn it. Can you sign up twice under two different names? We're here to help you, and we would love to sit down with a work session and consult with you and provide you what you need. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next up is Jennifer Ostrom.
Good morning. Thank you for letting us speak today. My name is Dr. Jennifer Ostrom. I'm a school psychologist. I'm here representing ASP as their ADE liaison. ASP applauds the efforts being made by the Arizona Department of Education and this committee for their work on early interventions and supports for students. ASP recognizes the serious nature of the decision we all must make to improve student achievement in reading while attending to the effects of assessment and retention on this progress. If not assessment and retention, what solutions and recommendations would result in better progress for all of our students, understanding that the financial investment in our students' future must be carefully planned. ASP urges educators at the state, district, and school levels, as well as legislators and other policymakers, to implement the following evidence-based practices in lieu of grade retention. In lieu of grade retention and social promotion, develop and implement a multi-tiered system of support across the district and school levels so that students have coordinated opportunities to access support along the continuum of need. Use state and local assessments and benchmarks, as well as formative assessment measures, to identify students who are struggling academically and behaviorally beginning in kindergarten. Provide educationally at-risk students opportunities to learn through quality pre-kindergarten programs and extended outside time of the school day and year. Identify and implement interventions that are targeted to the areas of academic, behavioral, social-emotional concerns, and implement these interventions with fidelity. Provide educators with training, consultation, and coaching that are aimed to enhance the effectiveness of targeted interventions. Support those students retained through their school careers with evidence-based academic and social-emotional support. In light of the research on the correlation of non-promotions in high school with dropping out of school, high school students need structured opportunities for credit recovery and targeted intervention, including the use of evidence-based practices for improving school attendance and positive behavioral supports. Expand engaging and relevant initiatives such as vocational education programs and career academies. For students identified with disabilities, address needs for possible increased support through the IEP as opposed to grade retention. Legislative policy should focus on adequate funding for schools to implement a multi-tiered system of supports and abolish policies that require mandated retention based on state assessments. Thank you.
Next is Mr. Duane Sheppard.
Good morning, members of the committee. My name is Duane Sheppard. I'm the Associate Superintendent for Yuma Elementary School District in Southwest Arizona. Thank you for the work that you're doing on the committee. I'm here to talk a little bit about retention for third graders. I realize that retention is a highly emotional charged issue. I really don't want to get into the debate of retention, but I want to talk about the data that goes behind retention about third graders that we're actually holding back because of the move on when reading law that's in place. And I'm encouraging the committee to look at those students in particular, monitoring what happened in their second year in third grade. And not only that, but longitudinally, what happened in fourth grade and fifth grade. And at this point, beginning next year, they will all be entering middle school. And what is their trajectory to be successful readers from this point out? And I think looking at that data, that can either be self-reported or it could be drawn from AZEDS. One of those mechanisms could easily give the data that's necessary for the school board to make future decisions and guide the decisions that you've been charged to do and make those recommendations. And so I'm here to encourage you to look at that data and find that data, and so it's available for everyone. Thank you.
Last is Chris Averitt.
Good morning, committee members. Thank you for being here. My name is Chris Harrod. I'm the assessment coordinator for Yuma Elementary School District. And I'm here just to express concern regarding the possibility of moving to one mandated screener. We currently have an assessment system in our district that we've used for a long time, and am concerned about having to move to another system with the additional costs that are involved in that. As you know, education funds are not often, but they are scarce. There's additional costs involved with professional development and training new staff members to administer a new test. Also, concerned as well as that some school districts may continue to administer their tests that they've been doing, as well as the new test, and adding just another layer of testing that doesn't need to take place. Lastly, just concerned about just the assault on local control and then allowing school districts to choose which assessment systems they use to assess their students. So I have some concern regarding that. I thank you for your time.
Madam Chair, that concludes the request to speak forms. And nobody else would like to speak?
Thank you. All right, moving on to item number 2, which is a presentation and discussion on the statewide assessment as it pertains to third grade reading ELA assessment. Do we have our ADE person?
Yes, Madam Chair and members, Audrey is here, but
there you are. Sorry, I didn't see you.
I think what we'll do here, and this is something that I will probably run through, and then when I inevitably am unable to answer some questions, then I will look to Audra. So really the purpose of this is partially to follow up on some of the discussions that the committee had at its last meeting. ECS did do some work for us, and they actually have not compiled everything that we were looking for. Admittedly, some of it is pretty in the weeds for ECS, but they are trying to find some resources for us to get to. So I wanted to share what they were able to provide, and then we can dive in back into that RFP discussion, and we've set up some guiding questions to try to direct some direct feedback that can be provided to the department. So very quickly, one of the things that ECS was able to pull together rather quickly was this question around sort of alluding to the public comment that was just provided of local control for those screeners and benchmark assessments. So ECS was able to pull up states that mandate and have a single statewide benchmark assessments, and then some that states have an approved list from which LEAs can select from. And all of the more detailed information along with the links is in that one-page handout that ECS did and was also provided. This is just me summing up some of those states, and then I just gave a couple examples. We don't have to go into details on that, just wanted to provide it and make sure that you were aware, and I wanted to put it in the PowerPoint so that way you had it and it triggered for you that you had that more detailed information. And then Acadians Reading is popping up more and more. And as it may also, there was one thing I wanted to point out about Colorado and how they have this list of approved assessments. Those assessments may look familiar because some of those are partially some of the things that we did through the exemption that was added in some of that work. Now, we've modified a little bit how that's carried out, but just wanted to let folks kind of trigger for folks, because this was something for me that was not eye-opening, but aware that it's very familiar what those assessments might be. So that's just some background information that we wanted to follow up on. The other information that ECS is going to try to help looking in for us, and that we'll try to get back to you at a later date, is what other states are incorporating the Big Five into their third grade reading assessments, if not other assessments, but probably those third grade ELA assessments. They're going to try to track that down for us, and then we can start looking into how they've done it, which might help inform our work a little bit better. So that's going to take a little bit more time. I think they had promised a deliverable of early next week, which now that's on the public record, I hope they follow through on. So transitioning, unless there's any questions on some of that information, I think we can just transition straight into the RFP assessment, piggybacking off of what we talked about last time. Sorry, I'm pausing because I don't know if Member Wellborn's trying to flag.
Member Wellborn and Member Yanez after that.
Thank you, Katja, for the update. I think one of the other questions we had of ECS was more around which states are showing progress and in improving rates. So they gave us a whole list of different ways to approach it, and I think the more informative question is, which way is leading to some positive achievement and getting the outcomes, the desired outcomes? So it doesn't necessarily, it's not as interesting to understand what states are doing things different ways. It's more important to understand what states are making inroads and how are they doing it.
Member Yanez.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And this is similar. I think we're getting to a similar question. And mine is on the list of states that were put up. There was only, I think, 7 states mentioned. Are those lists exhaustives, or is that just an example of states that are doing this?
Chairperson Clark, Superintendent Hoffman, Member Yanez, members of the committee. It is not an exhaustive list. For example, one of the first things that jumped out at me from states with a single universal screener was Nevada. Nevada passed their similar K-3 reading legislation about 5 years ago. They had full implementation 2 years ago, and they put out an RFP, and they have I'm not going to name the vendor, but they have a single vendor that they use. I'm in pretty close contact with Nevada, with actually most of my counterparts across the country, but they're actually opening another RFP for their universal screener. And I'm not casting any aspersions, but I think they would be a very interesting state to talk to, because they have actually gone that direction and seem to be making some changes. And so I think they would be a good group to discuss with, but it's not an exhaustive list. It is a good example of different state models that are out there, but it's not a complete list.
Thank you. And I would I guess, support the idea that, as we look at these states, it's good to have a list, but looking at sort of the rollout, the implementation, the outcomes from states that are doing something similar would be obviously very helpful.
And the results that they're getting.
Yeah.
Member Rest.
Okay, I would like to piggyback on Member Wellborn. I agree that we need to be looking at outcomes. That's really what we're after here, is improving outcomes for students. But I also would like to echo a lot of the comments that we heard this morning about looking long-term, not just looking at who's having success with third grade reading outcomes, not just who's then showing that success on fourth grade NAEP scores, but who's showing an increase in graduation rates, who's showing that students are entering or leaving our system more ready for college or career or whatever paths that they choose. So we need to not get caught up in this trap of short-term gains that we know from the research fade. We need to be looking long-term and acting in the best interest of our students.
Okay. So back to some of the discussions that the committee had last meeting around the RFP. After some of those discussions, we thought it might be a good idea to try to focus in on a couple specific questions. And one of the questions that staff thought anyways it might be good to revisit is the purpose behind the ad hoc committee's original recommendation. And the intent is not necessarily to reopen that for discussion and debate. It's more to revisit it and why. Because we feel like at the last committee meeting, there was some renewed discussion about why a dedicated third grade reading assessment, whether that's embedded into the ELA assessment or separate and apart, but regardless, beefing out that reading part of that assessment, why that was recommended. And so we just wanted to bring up the ad hoc committee's recommendation on this item specifically. And, there was a lot as part of this issue, but it probably hits more at recommendation number 1 in that third bullet point. And then it's sort of all tied into, again, part of this comprehensive assessment system, which the ad hoc committee talked a lot about. And then this sort of leads into all the other guiding questions. So I think depending on how the committee would like to do this, we could sort of talk about these one at a time, and then, if there's additional questions, then Audrey or I could, or Sean could try to jump in and assist. But as ADE is beginning to develop the RFP for this assessment, and as the board is going to start providing direct feedback as soon as the October board meeting, it would be good if the committee could contemplate some of these and maybe have some discussion around it today, or even if you want to take some time, because I realize these materials were provided yesterday, I think. If you want to take some time and maybe provide some feedback after the committee directly to staff, then that may be helpful as well. But some of the things on here, and I'll just sort of give a big overview, and then the committee can, Madam Chair, and then I can hand it over to you, and you can how you'd like to organize it. So the first question we already talked about. The second question was actually something that was alluded to in the public comment, and we talked about at the last committee meeting, which is alignment between what this third grade assessment is and all the other benchmarking and assessing that's happening in earlier grades. Now, if the ad hoc committee's recommendations are put into statute and we have a single statewide screener and benchmark assessments, then that's something that the state can have a little more control on ensuring alignment. If that's not the case, though, how do we ensure that the vendor, whoever the new vendor is going to be, is trying to make it easier to ensure that alignment, and how all the other vendors who are providing those other assessments are working with them? We talked a lot about the Big Five last time, and then I think the trade-offs, Member Wellborn alluded to some of the trade-offs that might come with incorporating the Big Five. And mostly that includes, the length of test in terms of the number of questions and the time, and then some of the PD and training that's required. I think the committee needs to have, some discussions, and I think it began last time, but maybe we can continue it here about, are those trade-offs worth it, and is that something that the committee wants to specifically recommend finding ways to solve those? Part of that, if that is the case, part of that is still going to be looking at those other states and ensuring that they were able to make it work and how they were able to make it work. And then lastly, how do we communicate to the vendor the importance of third grade reading assessment? Some of this came up in ECS's PowerPoint as well. And some of this is trying to communicate to the vendor and try to ensure that they have flexibility to move with us, and that if we make it a priority, then they will as well. And that's something that we want to communicate. That's maybe not necessarily anything that needs specific guidance, but something I think I wanted to put on there. So, Madam Chair, however you'd like to break this out, I'm happy to help facilitate.
Great. Thank you, Catcher. Well, I think let's just, if everyone's okay with it, we'll just take the questions from the top and maybe start with the first one of just revisiting the purpose of the recommendation around a dedicated third grade reading assessment and whether it's embedded in the ELA assessment or a separate one. Are there any additional thoughts on that or new viewpoints that anyone has around that topic? Sure, Superintendent Hoffman.
Thank you, Chairwoman Clark and members of the committee. I guess one of my questions would be, and this has come up in our state board meetings as well, the question for the question is around the inventory of what testing is already occurring. So back to are all of our third grade students taking benchmark testing? Do we have that data? If so, then I would assume that all of their, well, I guess then the second question would be what components are in the third grade benchmark testing? And just being able to have a comparison. So before we're adding a whole nother test, having a better sense of what third grade assessments are already being given.
So Sean, I'm going to let you take that. Thanks.
Chairperson Clark, Superintendent Hoffman, members of the committee. Superintendent Hoffman, per the Move On When Reading legislation, every K-3 student is assessed with benchmark assessments 3 times per year. So the beginning of the year, middle of the year, end of year. That data are actually submitted to the department. The Move On When Reading team, Sarah Bondi and I, we actually collect that data every year, and then we run aggregate data in the Move On When Reading annual report that's released on December 15th. So there is benchmark assessing of every K-3 student 3 times per year. The data are collected and the data are reviewed. The one thing I would add to it, based on Ketcher's earlier comment, is there's not a mandated list of assessments to choose from for benchmarks. We have created criteria for what is a valid literacy benchmark assessment, which the department created with stakeholder groups and which was approved by the board about 2 years ago, maybe a year and a half ago. So we have criteria for that, but as is the case with many things in Arizona, there are a number of different assessment types and assessment vendors being used currently. We have good relationships with those vendors. We speak with them quite frequently to make sure we're plugged into what they're assessing and what's occurring, but there is a variety. So as an example, you will have an assessment, and I'm not preferencing one vendor over another, I'm just using a vendor as an example, but you'll have an assessment like DIBELS, which is really designed to assess the underpinnings of the elements of early literacy, everything from phonological awareness up to elements of comprehension, but mostly in that phonological awareness, phonemic awareness, that fluency range. And then you have something like Galileo, for example, which is commonly used around the state, which historically actually assessed one-to-one for the standards. Though Galileo and companies of that type have actually moved to a point where they've now developed universal screeners for their systems that actually mimic what we see in a vendor like DIBELS. So they do assess for those underpinnings. Another example would be somebody like NWEA. They have NWEA growth, which is their early elements of literacy assessment. And then they have NWEA MAP. I may be getting that backwards, Sarah? MAP growth and MAP reading fluency. Thank you. That's Sarah Bondi, who was amazing. So there's MAP reading fluency, which assesses those underpinnings. Then MAP growth takes it to a one-to-one standard level. What we often see in the data are that K2 schools use something like that MAP reading fluency or DIBELS because those grade levels are obviously much more focused on those underpinnings. And then we do often see a switch in third grade to something that is a bit more comprehension driven, like Galileo, for example, or Star Renaissance, or one of those types of vendors.
Thank you. Yes.
So, thank you for the opportunity to go back to that really important question about purpose. I feel like we've had lots of meetings, and I sort of feel like maybe we have diverged a bit in the purpose and how we're thinking about the purpose of assessment. When we originally started having conversations, for me, the question really was about, or was first raised about having a statewide kindergarten assessment, and we heard some testimony about the importance of that. I'm a district where we really believe in local control. We feel like we know our students best, and we are fine to get in the work, into the work that needs to be done on their behalf. But I was interested in the statewide universal kindergarten screener because we know that currently resources are incredibly inequitable. So that state funding that came along with this Move On When Reading legislation is set to a per pupil allocation regardless of need. So when we have a school with 100% of students, for example, using DIBELS as their universal screener, and 100% of those students walk in on the first day of school, because we are to assess within the first 2 weeks, and they are meeting all incoming kindergarten benchmarks, that school gets the same resources as a school who comes in where 100% of their students are not meeting those beginning of year kindergarten resources. And so it was something that I was interested in only in its ability to address those inequities, that we can see where the need is and we can realign resources to address that need and provide opportunity for those students who needed it. Since then, it feels like it has become just assessment for the purpose of really ultimately at the end of third grade for drawing that new cut score, the ease it would present to us in drawing a cut score for retention. So sometimes I feel like I'm the lone voice, but I want to take this opportunity to express again concern with that use of assessment, concern with the time that it takes to have an assessment, an extra assessment put in not only in kindergarten but all the way through third grade. We have those benchmark assessments already in place as we use DIBELS to screen, to progress monitor, and to benchmark students at K-3, and we are not interested in losing any more time to assessment in our district.
Thank you, Member Ref. Anyone else?
Hello, this is Carmen Koster.
Yes, please, go ahead.
And I'd like to reiterate the comments that were just made. The number of assessments that our students have to take already, it seems like we're trying to layer on an additional assessment in a very short time period. In our district, we also have to give a ZELA, which is also a very time-consuming, as we have to do the speaking piece, which is a one-on-one assessment. And so it seems that our students are going to lose precious instructional time to continue assessing when Move On When Reading already has those components in place with the 3 times that we're doing our benchmark assessment.
Member Wellborn and Member Yanis.
Thank you, Chairman Clark. I want to agree with the sentiments of what Member Ref said and others. It seems like the focus of this committee has gone down the rabbit hole of just assessment, and we're spending an awful time on the assessment piece when we all know really pretty much what the data is going to show us. And our focus, if you know, the whole purpose, I think it's a valid one to have some statewide information, but it's only like an initial first step towards what we need to be focusing on. And the real issue is we have 55% of our third graders that are not reading. So no matter what kind of test we give them, whether we continue with local control or statewide or whatever, the data is still going to reinforce that number. It's whether give or take 5 points, right? So it would, to me, the purpose is really, if you go back, Catcher, to the slide before, my vote would be that we focus on the little tiny bullet point under such a system would yield baseline progressive data for all K-3 students so as to facilitate early identification, intervention, and the targeting of additional resources. And I would suggest that we spend a lot more time and energy around what is needed with this large majority of our students and how do we get it to them so that we can address the issue, because to me the assessment issue should be done and put away, and let's start focusing on what are the resources that would start addressing the need.
Other comments? Then we'll go on. Can you go back to the list of questions? We're going to move on. I think we've hit some of this, but the second question on how do we achieve alignment between summative third grade reading and K-3 screeners, and then that last question, alignment study with K-3 assessments. Sean, you referenced that that you collect and aggregate the benchmark data. Is the benchmark data showing a predictive of how we do on the summative for AZ Merit at this moment?
Chairperson Clark, Superintendent Hoffman, members of the committee, the benchmark data in aggregate shows that about an average of 65% of our kindergarten through third grade students are at benchmark by the end of the year, which is not supported by the third grade reading score, or actually third grade ELA scores on AZ Merit. So I would not argue that they are currently in alignment.
Sorry, Sean, can you say that again?
So currently, and this was as of the last couple years, we're currently reviewing literacy plans right now. We have about 500 waiting for us back at the office. And then when we're done reviewing them and when they've been approved, we build an aggregate report. So I'll have more accurate data after December 15th. But the big average is basically about on the third benchmark assessment for K-3 students, on average, it shows about 65% of students are at benchmark by the end of the school year. That's for kindergarten through third grade. And then obviously that doesn't align with, I think we're now at 46% of students who are passing the third grade AZ Merit ELA exam.
Chairman Clark, I think we also heard at our last meeting that just the fact by giving the assessment a second time, we'd likely see a 15% improvement. Did we hear that last time? That just there's data that shows that if you're given the opportunity to take the same test twice, your performance can improve 10 to 15%. I thought we heard that from our assessment expert last month.
She's shaking her head no.
Yeah, didn't we talk about that? That maybe not Arizona's experience, but other testing shows that in other states.
You might be thinking of Mississippi.
Yeah, Madam Chair.
Maybe it was Mississippi. That
other states that have multiple.
Right.
They allow multiple. Yeah.
Okay, right. So if Mississippi is the example that they see, what was it, 10 or 15% improvement? Is that right?
I don't know if they see an improvement. They allow multiple times for the test, so they're.
And Madam Chair, Member Wellborn, and Audrey can correct me if I'm wrong. Part of the validity that the state does, like with AZ Merit or AZM2, is that they want the same student to take the test when they're ensuring that this test is valid and reliable multiple times in a short period of time to ensure that the scores aren't all over the place, in which if they were, then that would be a red flag that the assessment isn't valid and reliable and it's getting multiple results at random. So part of when they were developing AZ Merit is the scores were very much similar, but I think maybe it's a different program what you were talking about in Mississippi, but I don't recall what the conversation was. I'm sorry. And Madam Chair, members, if I can, the second part of the question on the second bullet point is something that we had talked to Audra about as a possibility, with, depending on how legislation progresses in the next 2 years, it is possible for the state to ask in an RFP that the vendor, develop an alignment study with those other products in the K-3 systems with benchmarks. And that could be, it might be an additional cost for the state. It certainly would be for the vendor, but that would be something that would help assist decisions potentially at the local level if that was still a local decision. So that was a recommendation, something to consider.
So I went back to my notes.
Okay, she found
I'm sorry, it was from ECS. That in Mississippi, the students can take the assessment multiple times, and the passing increases about 12% in subsequent testing. So, Sean, my question to you is, the fact that benchmarks are given multiple times indicates that you're seeing a subsequent testing. And are we really comparing apples to apples when you say there's a difference between what the benchmark is showing and what the assessment is showing, given it's the different nature of the test?
Chairperson Clark, Superintendent Hoffman, Member Wellborn, they are different exams. They are different assessments, so the data are not directly comparable. The benchmarks are different from AZ Merit. They're different from the statewide exam. So you are actually comparing two different assessments, data from two different assessments. I think to get to the point, the question about the amount of times they take it, now these benchmark exams do show progression over the course of the year. And so the students are expected to show equivalent progression as they take them. And one of the things that's really important to keep in mind is between the periods of benchmarking, so beginning of the year, middle, and end, there's a lot of instruction that happens. And then when students are properly identified early with that universal screener as being at risk or below benchmark for reading, they are receiving targeted interventions. And so I think you could attribute the increase in scores to the effectiveness of instruction and intervention as well. I think that plays a role too.
I'd also like to bring up another point as long as we're talking about guiding principles here. Way back when we made these recommendations, we did talk about the notion of this high-stakes testings and how wouldn't it be great if we could get away from a one-day assessment, and that we wanted could we have a more of a mastery approach to testing such that students could have multiple time to try and demonstrate their proficiency. That kind of discussion seems to me to be a more important discussion to what we're trying to accomplish than the discussion around alignment. Because as long as we have local control determining what the programs are and the benchmarks and all that, I don't know that the alignment issue can ever be resolved. It's really up to local control to decide if they want to align to the state's test, and that's their responsibility and challenge. What I think would be really fruitful is to think big picture about, well, how could we address some of the issues around test taking, such as high-stakes testing, such as offering it multiple times, such as whatnot. I would, and I know we get hung up on funding of it, but I really like to see us inform the future. Maybe we can't afford this today, but maybe this is something that we need to make a statement about going forward long term. We'd like to see the nature of literacy assessment changed when, if possible.
You want to address, you had one point you wanted to clarify?
Madam Chair, Member Wellborn, I think I would, on staff, I guess I would challenge the committee, and I think in Arizona sometimes we have a tendency to cite local control and throw up our hands, and I think we as the ad hoc committee and I think the board have influence to motivate the vendors to ensure alignment to the summative assessment. And I think that we are the state, and that is the statewide assessment. And I think that rather than call it a day and try to, and I'm not saying that your other recommendations are maybe not worth exploring, and that, but those are just my
Patrick,
initial.
correct me if I'm wrong, when we started off over a year ago, did we not have data from the Mauer office that basically says of the majority of the programs and benchmarks used, so I'm understanding that of perhaps 80% of the schools are in the same 5 programs, right? Is it something like that, Sean? So with that subset, there's no indice, there's no direct correlation between benchmarks, reading programs, and screeners. There's none of them were more effective than the other in terms of predicting outcomes. Is that correct?
Sean, do you want to address that?
So Member Wellborn, Chairperson Clark, Superintendent Hoffman, there was a study commissioned by Read on Arizona that was done by the Morrison Institute, Rob Vaghi at the Morrison Institute, who actually has presented to this committee in the past. The Move On When Reading team, we worked in conjunction with Rob, and one of the research questions that he asked was, is there a universal screener that is showing better results in student achievement? Now, just to caution, this is correlation is not causation, so we want to make sure we really, say that up front, and Rob was really careful about that as well. But in examining, he did a regression analysis study looking at the use of specific universal screeners and then looking at the use of multiple universal screeners, and there was no magic button. So I would say based on that study, that is a correct assumption that at the moment we do not have data to show that a single screener leads to higher student achievement.
Right.
Oh, let's wait till she's done.
So does that not inform this issue around alignment?
Yeah.
Actually, can you clarify your question, Member Wellborn?
So this second question is raising the question around, should there be better alignment between screeners, diagnostics, and benchmarks? And if you decide what better alignment means, theoretically it means more effective outcomes, right? So if your study says there is no correlation between any one screener or benchmark to outcomes, what's the point of alignment?
Can I just clarify, or do you want to clarify, is that what that last question, I think that's around alignment to the summative.
Right.
Right.
So Chairperson Clark, Superintendent Hoffman, Member Wellborn, I think I can address part of this question in that most LEAs in the state actually use the same assessment for their screener and for their benchmark. So there is alignment in that it is the same vendor and the same system. The question, I think the larger question at hand is the alignment between the benchmark assessment that students take 3 times a year and then the summative assessment, AZ Merit at this time, AZM2, at this time. So that's the alignment I think we're referring to, Chairperson Clark.
That's what I thought, but I could have been wrong. So I think Member Reff and then Member Vickman.
I think what might be helpful also in this discussion is understanding what happens to that alignment that the vendors have done historically to support their products, and what happens when they get into schools and classrooms where we are very concerned about how students perform. And I think that some of the effects that we see where that alignment tends to get off is because we are in an environment of constant test taking and this belief that if we could just meet that oral reading fluency score, everything will be great, so let's just keep timing kids and having them read faster. And that is not the case. And so I think it would be interesting to see how that alignment differs between schools and how that's related to local control and how we as leaders in school districts talk to teachers about what is the purpose of these benchmarks and these screeners and these progress monitoring tools. In our district, we are constantly reminding our teachers that we do not want good test takers. We want good readers. We want children who can read, and that these we call their dipsticks, really, to see, like, where is this child now? It doesn't mean that we need to now spend inordinate amount of time to prepare them for the next time they have to perform in that environment. It means that we need to look at broad reading achievement in all the areas of reading achievement and support students. And so I think that that alignment gets off depending on how it is used locally. And I would also suggest that there are differences in the administration of DIBELS and Ames Web and assessments like that, where they questions reliability.
Member Vickman, did you have anything to add? I thought.
Just to kind of piggyback on what Member Ruff said. So the alignment to me is important because we do give the tests that one is the phonological awareness more test, but that's not in great alignment with the AZ Merit because AZ Merit's that's asking, can you read? The AZ Merit is, are you understanding what you read, and can you take that information and get information out of it from your reading. To me, it's when you give that formative, when you give the test, no matter which one it is that the district is using, no matter which one, if we have a bank that the local control, they can choose their test. It's how is it being used to get the student prepared to take that AZ Merit. So is the school district training the teachers to take that information, to look at it, and to dive deeper into it and do a diagnostic on it to determine what are the needs of the students, or are they just giving it and saying, this is where they're at, okay, let's keep going. So what are they doing? So I think an important part of this is helping the districts to give that professional development and the needs to the teachers to be able to take the data, no matter what we use, and help the students to improve.
All right, we're going to move on to the next question, which was how do other states incorporate the Big Five? And you said ECS is working on answering that for us. And we did ask, and if you could remind them, that we wanted it especially around those that are seeing better outcomes. But I think we could have a conversation about, to help inform the current RFP process going forward, how do we currently include vocabulary and comprehension as part of AZ Merit 2. And to your point, we unlike 20 some other states who have some sort of K-2 assessment going on to know how their system is doing, we only start that in third grade. So how could we, or should we think about including incorporating the Big Five? And to sort of piggyback on Member Ruff, one of the recommendations originally was to start to think about a comprehensive system that helped us identify and get supports to students as early in the process as possible, not waiting till third grade. So that universal screener was a common baseline to say, how's everyone coming into our system? So then we can know how we're moving them up through third grade. But the trouble is right now, we only know individually at the local level how they're being moved. We can't say how the system is doing, and are we breaking down in phonological awareness? Are we breaking down in some of these other things, so that we can say, to Member Wellmore's point, how the 54%, what are their needs? Why didn't they score a passing score on the AZM2? So that's the conversation I'd love for us to have, and why you were all on this ad hoc to help us think through some of these difficult issues. So please, who wants to? Member Yanas, you brave soul.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We'll see. Brave, but we'll see if I'm wise or not. So, yeah, I think it's smart to kind of collapse those two, you know, the inclusion of the Big Five as well as, you know, what's the trade-off. And, you know, when I look at the first bullet under, you know, the trade-offs, and we talk about length of test, and I know we've talked about this before. So to sort of have a comprehensive assessment that does everything in the world we might want it to do, that's at least 30 additional test items, which may not sound like a lot, but in this type of assessment, that can be a significant amount of time that we're talking. Couple that with what I think we talked about 2 meetings ago around sort of a more robust this test do too much. And we need to be clear about what we really are trying to measure and for what purpose. Because I think we can fall in love with an assessment and make it do all kinds of things at the expense of sort of torturing our kids to sit down for an unfair amount of time to pull out a lot of different measures.
This is Dana Burke.
Go ahead,
Can you hear
Dana.
me? So I believe Audrey Rest brought this up at the last meeting, but I would have strong concerns about isolating phonemic awareness and phonological awareness as well as reading fluency for an AZM2. It would require one-on-one, you know, kind of like the Azella on a phone perhaps, and just the time it would take to assess these skills in isolation would be a huge burden and time out of the classroom for all of the students that needed to take it. And I was thinking of the discussion that you all were just having in terms of the alignment between our benchmark and the assessment. And by 3rd grade, so for example, you know, phonological awareness is embedded within skilled reading. Phonics is embedded within skilled reading. And the reason in my mind when I watch my students why we have 65% meeting benchmark on our benchmark assessments, so for example, DIBELS versus when they go to take AZ Merit, is because these skills are pulled out in isolation. It's a little 1-minute assessment versus sitting down for an hour and a half, 2 hours to take a reading test that folds all of the Big Five in together. So to me, the Big Five is being assessed repeatedly throughout our benchmarks. And so I agree with Member Wellborn's sentiment that maybe we need to start thinking if we want to pull the Big Five apart and look at where is this falling apart. Is it that 3rd graders don't have a strong base in phonics? That we could perhaps find a way to look at benchmark data that's already being collected at this level versus trying to reassess it again on a 3rd grade assessment like AZ Merit. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Any other comments? Dawn, Aaron, you know? Yeah.
I would come back and piggyback that I think that the key here that we shouldn't overlook is while we're still doing a lot of assessments and still doing a lot of things, are we really using that data to the fullest potential? And not underestimating that maybe there's more professional development that needs to be put into place so that we are looking at what ones we are using and how to escalate the results to that. Because I feel that sometimes we're just checking the boxes and we're really not using it. So when we look at the comparisons, we may have done it, but did we do anything about it? Or how did we do something about it? I think that that's an area that we probably need to investigate a little bit more into as well, to where we see some success.
All right. I'm not sure, I think we've covered then both of those other two. And then I'm not sure yet we're ready to be prepared to basically communicate to the vendor the importance of the 3rd grade reading assessment until we define what that more clearly. It would help to make sure to get this committee from the further information from the ECS, and we can add that. But again, encouraging everyone, if there's anything that you feel we don't cover in this conversation today, please share with State Board staff and get them your additional thoughts. Is there anything, Audrey, that you want to add to this?
Yes, Chair Persinger. Sorry, do you want me to come up here?
Please, come up and join us.
You gotta
Come
go
right
to the
up there.
podium, Audrey.
We welcome you.
Thank you. The only thing I would like to add is that there's always time issues, so we need the recommendation as soon as possible about the RFP. My idea is to maybe put it as an option so that anytime we can exercise that for a third grade reading assessment embedded pieces, but it wouldn't be part of the RFP, but that's going to be sent to the board at the end of the month or maybe a few weeks, early November. So we have a very tight timeline of your recommendation tied for just the RFP part of it. Does that make sense? Okay.
Thank you for reminding us about that, and we will work through staff to get you that. Member Yanez.
Sorry, I apologize. I feel like I need to make just one statement about this entire conversation, which is more looking at the system. So I'm going to try to keep us on track here in terms of what this task force charge is. But, I mean, none of this happens in a vacuum, and there are a number of other policy implications for what, not just this committee recommends, but ultimately what the state board does and what the legislation looks like. So the one thing that's in the back of my mind as we go through this, and some of this has been alluded to, is, you know, when a comprehensive assessment system is created in that K-2 space, there will be this irresistible pull by some to start using this in accountability systems, which is not something that is in our charge, but I think we need to be mindful about how that conversation ultimately happens. And that, to me, is a bit worrisome for a lot of reasons, but primarily on the status side. You know, to hold schools accountable on status measures for kids that literally just walked into their door is, from an equity standpoint, very troublesome. But having been in a number of those conversations over, I don't know, a couple of decades now, there will be, I mean, this is going to happen. This conversation is going to happen, and I think that we would be, well, I would be supportive of at least providing some guidance, which, again, I don't want to creep outside of the mission, but I think it's important to have that conversation.
Great point. Thank you for bringing that up. Make sure to follow through on that. All right. So we are going to move on to item number 3.
Madam Chair and members, item 3 is some of the draft statutory changes that we've seen a few times. Staff has, since the last time the committee's seen it, tightened up some of the language on the session law language. And also, Member Yanez brought up a good point about if funding is not available, so we threw in a little if sufficient appropriations are made to help cover us. And I think there were some specifically on the appropriation and what supports those would go towards. There was an ask to be a little more specific, that would be an opportunity for the committee and the board to communicate effectively to the legislature what those dollars would be used for and how they would support improved outcomes. So what we did, and we're still working with ADE's team on both the number and some of the language in there, but we just took what the committee already put in their recommendations from December and put it into that session law language at the end, because we feel like the committee already had a pretty good discussion about what those would go to support, what that additional appropriation would go to support, and so, you know, rather than reinvent the wheel, we just kind of incorporated that. So, and I think that was in the, so with that, there wasn't any additional comments outside of those, and staff did the best they could to address those from the last committee. So if the committee still feels good about it, we would probably recommend the committee make a recommendation to the board to consider this at their next meeting when they start setting their legislative priorities for the 2020 legislative session.
Chairman Clark?
Member Wilborn.
Ketcher, can I ask a question? At one time, I thought we heard that there was perhaps not going to be legislative support for the second piece of this legislative change. That there would be support for a universal screener statewide, but the K-2 benchmarks, statewide benchmarks, that was unlikely to have legislative support. Can you inform us a little bit about what your expectation is on, as it currently stands, what's the likelihood it to be supported?
Madam Chair and Member Wellborn, the comment that you were referring to was me kind of like shaking the magic ball and trying to look into the future. We have had conversations at that time and still have had a couple other conversations with members, legislative members, about their interest in getting some of their feedback. I think it's hard to predict. I think, as I mentioned earlier, and as is alluded to here in public comment today, local control on those assessments is going to be hard to make an argument to have a statewide assessment in some of those areas. But at the same time, this committee, I would recommend this committee recommend what they feel is best policy, and the board and the board's legislative committee can work on the ins and outs of the politics of it. But if the committee feels that that's the best policy, and it's within the charge of the committee, then we would recommend moving forward with what the committee feels is best.
So, Ketcher, I just want to be clear that we are we've seen this multiple times. We are not reviewing or going back to whether the recommendation is something because those recommendations have been made. We're just looking at your language to see if you captured the accuracy of the recommendation that's already been approved by this ad hoc.
Right. Yep. Okay. Sorry, that was couching that I should have provided.
Another question. Sorry, I don't mean to hog up all the questions. What is the situation or status or recommendation with regard to page 9? This still says flesh out more.
Yeah, and I noticed, I also realized as I was talking, I was trying to look up what I provided, and I don't know why it looks like I provided a previous edition. So that's not right. But let me.
You're human?
Yeah. Let me pull up what it should have been. And I apologize. Thank you for catching that, Member Wilburn. I apologize for the error there. And what I'll pull up is really, as I had mentioned, it's already from the committee's recommendations, the language that I pulled. So what I'm going to pull up is just the language that I essentially copied and pasted from this committee's previous recommendation about that appropriation. And then you'll just have to mentally transpose it into the language that says flesh out more. Okay, so here we go. This right here about what the supports would include is what should be in page 9 of that draft.
So that in place of flesh out more.
In place of flesh out more in all caps, which is
detail provided that were in the recommendation would be placed there.
Yes.
Which I think built on what you had pointed out last time, Member Wellborn. So we asked that get changed.
Yes, and Madam Chair and Member Wellborn, again, I apologize for the mistake, and we'll still work with ADE and on what the number is going to be that is not in there, and if there's anything else that they feel would be relevant. And of course, sorry, I don't mean to cut you off. And depending on the number, that such support could include, obviously,
right.
If it's a small number, that we will have to reprioritize. And if it's a big number, maybe we can start talking about what else it could include.
All right, Member Wellborn, I'm going to let you finish, and then Vince. Do you
Sorry,
have
I'm hogging up all the airtime here. I apologize. Okay, so let's. This to me again is the crux of actually making progress. And I would suggest we look at again the issue of the bottom 10%, because that's horribly short of the need. We might also look at tying funding to the student rather than the schools. So we talked earlier about sort of how do we target funds to the needs of the student. And so one option would be using the universal screener or the benchmark data will inform or help us identify where the need is. And so theoretically, you tie supplemental funding resources to demonstrated need based on what we learn, what the outcomes are on the K-2 benchmark. So this, by putting something around that idea in there, you're really connecting the first part to the second part. Again, the point of the assessment is all about helping us provide targeted intervention to where the need is. So that's where I'd like to see us providing, using this section about directing funds and resources to where the schools, the students that need it.
Madam Chair, Member Wellborn, I'm sorry. Just a clarifying question: is that specific to this funding ask for ADE's supports, or is that like a? Are you talking comprehensively about more funds and early literacy grants?
Well, this is the only area that talks about funding at all.
Right.
So, and it's theoretically funding could be. I don't want to get caught up in the specifics here, but theoretically, you can have designated resources at ADE that have all sorts of skills, but who are they helping? The answer should be they need to be targeted. They are the supplemental resources that go and work with the schools that have the highest need. So whether it's a state position or a state resource, or it's funding that goes directly to the school, can be debated. But the intent is not to, if we're going to build this capability at the department, that supplemental resource is targeted to help. So let's say it's a reading coach is one of the positions, and you say the reading coach. I just don't want to lose track. We're not building administrative support and state resources for anything. It's part of communicating the message that this is for helping the kids that need it.
Most, right? Yeah. All right. Member Yanis, did you have something? Okay. Member Ruff and then Member Hart?
Sure. So I think that I was the sole voice that was on the record as dissenting from this draft of the legislation, and I appreciate that there are timelines, but in the interest of the best interest of our students, I have 3 recommendations to advance, hopefully at this point. One is around sort of linking with Member Wellborn and funding. If we go to page 4, lines 20 through 23, statewide universal screener adopted by the board that school districts and charter schools administer to students in kindergarten within 45 calendar days after beginning each school year or within 45 calendar days after a student enrolls for the purpose of identifying needs and allocating equitable resources or allocating resources in an equitable manner. That would be another place where we can insert our intent if we are moving toward a statewide universal screener. And then in lines 24 through 26, just beneath that, just one final ask that we do consider changing the language instead of a statewide benchmark tool, a menu of approved progress monitoring and benchmark tools adopted by the board for kindergarten through grade 3 that measures progress towards reading proficiency at the end of 3rd grade. Finally, because parents should be involved in every facet of children's education. On page 5, where we are describing what needs to be in parent notification, I would ask that we include the research on retention with a statement that a full disclosure of the research on retention and its known effects be provided for parents. And ECS was kind enough to respond to my question when we met last about the correlation between retention and high school graduation, and I quote from them, "However, research on retention is mixed. At best, students have demonstrated short-term gains in achievement, in academic achievement, at best. This study also found that retention has no effect on the likelihood of graduating from high school. That means when students are retained, we are not solving the problem of high school graduation. They are no more likely to be graduating from high school with an extra year in third grade. Other research, and I'm still quoting ECS, has found retention to be an ineffective, if not harmful, policy response."
Thank you, Member Ruff. And I believe that based on the information they sent you and some other sources, we have now compiling a comprehensive research packet on retention around third grade reading, and that will get shared with this ad hoc group. But it was not complete before this meeting, so I'm sorry that we could not get that to you in advance. But Sean has been working on that along with State Board staff. So we'll have more for you to ponder around that because there are multiple points of view on that. And research continues to be found. So, Member Hart.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have two things. One is in follow-up to the recommendation regarding funding. I'm curious if staff or others could help us understand this. I know we don't yet know the size and scope of the amount we're actually talking about, but I think that actually matters a lot. So if we have, is there any kind of gut check we have? Because that first item alone could be pretty substantial and could make actually significant difference in the work that we're talking about. So I'm curious about size and scope, if we have a gut check, and then and how that would be deployed. Are we talking 2 additional staff for FTE, or are we talking about funding that would support that swarm strategy that Sean has talked to us before multiple? And those are just examples, so they may not be exactly what we would do, but I'm just kind of curious about size and scope.
Can Sean speak to that a little bit, or do you want to speak to that, Catcher? And again, I don't think anybody wants to put you on the spot. There's no answer to that as far as on solid numbers.
Yeah, Madam Chair, Member Hart. Unfortunately, I'm calling out the punt team, and I'm just going to have to punt on it. And it's not to be evasive. It's simply that ADE is still just trying to pull some of that together, and then of course, they already went through a whole process on funding requests and trying to pull it back together, and of course also aware that the politics of whatever number comes out is going to be, highly important in terms of if it's too high or if it's too low, and all those things that go into it. So it just needs to be fleshed out a little bit more, and we'll just have to get back to the committee on it.
Okay, thank you.
But it's valid.
It was a somewhat unfair question, so thank you for at least entertaining it. But I think it will matter a lot. So let us know if we can be helpful with that. My second thing was around the language on page 4 around the assessment package. I'm curious about the readiness of the field, like the receptivity that we think this would get out of the gate from education stakeholders across the state, and just thinking about the work that would need to be done, if needed, to facilitate buy-in and support for this package of things. I'm wondering if this is going to feel, and my perception is it's going to feel like more assessment, and that would come at a cost. So I'm trying to think about how the field will receive this, what the high message would be, which I think is more assessment, and what are the trade-offs, what are the wins for the field? So How is the field feeling about this to date?
Madam Chair and Member Hart, also good points and things that we are going to start, once, in some ways, staff's always in a tricky position with a public board, and that, we want to be very careful about the kind of conversations that we have with stakeholders and with legislators that the board hasn't, seen or officially approved. Of course, they've seen a lot of these recommendations. So we've been able to have some conversations. And I think part of what we're going to have to do, and I think Alicia had mentioned something like this too, sometimes these are multi-year processes, as I know that you're aware as well. And part of it's just going to have to be communication, both to the legislators and to the stakeholders, that the intent is not for more testing. And in fact, this is, testing that they're already doing and are mandated already to be doing through Move On When Reading. We're just taking a different approach to it. And then for the cost, of course, either to the local level, but I think based on the committee's discussions, and I think we would recommend on staff that that's something that the state would cover. Of course, that's always a separate conversation with the legislature too, that has all of its own pitfalls. But that's why it might be a multi-year process, and that's why we kind of wanted to make sure that the committee had plenty of time to discuss it before, rushing out and talking to stakeholders. And, it could be an iterative process that, can start to begin once the board gives its stamp of approval in a couple weeks.
Superintendent Hoffman.
Thank you, Chairwoman Clark and members of the committee. I had a quick question too, but sorry, I am newer to this conversation. I was curious, how does the recommendation for the statewide universal screener, how does it relate to the new statute for universal dyslexia screening? Is this, how do these relate to each other?
Chairperson Clark, Superintendent Hoffman, members of the committee. So there is a Senate Bill 1318 was signed into law this past July. It calls for the mandatory screening of kindergarten and first grade students for characteristics consistent with dyslexia, as well as a teacher education component. The screening is to begin next school year, the education component by July 2021. As part of the legislation, there is a Senate screening committee. Superintendent Hoffman appointed me to that committee. We've met twice at this point and are having some rich discussions about the indicators that are called for and sort of how that screening process and then the education process will progress. At this point, no final decisions have been made, but what we are calling for is to embed the new dyslexia legislation requirements for screening. So there's a list of indicators, to echo what some people have called for, ranging from assessing for phonological awareness, phonemic awareness deficits, all the way to like letter sound correspondence. And what we've been able to do, with one exception on the indicators, which I won't necessarily go into right now, is speak to the most commonly used vendors in the state, and they have agreed that they are, or either have or are going to embed those new indicators into their current screeners. And we have had them guarantee that they will do it at no extra cost to schools, which is really important to us. So as of right now, and again, there's a key discussion that's happening over one of the indicators in the list. But as of right now, it does look as if there is going to be an avenue forward where the actual screening process doesn't change at all. In fact, it's one of the things we've really tried to talk about as we discuss the new dyslexia screening legislation, is that we don't want it to be one more thing for schools. We certainly don't want it to be an extra financial burden for schools, and that if we would like to use it as a lever to really leverage improved screening processes across the board for K-3 literacy. And so right now, given where we are in discussions, there wouldn't be a monumental impact in the screening process. Now, the data that comes from that process, and I know a couple of the members have discussed this, how that data are acted upon, that's another piece of discussion. But right now, if the pieces fall the way we think they may, it wouldn't be much different than the current process. Does that answer your question?
And I think just to add on that, the intent was that a statewide universal screener would incorporate any of that.
That was my question. Thank
But,
you.
yes,
No,
and-
thank you for the details.
Sorry.
Madam Chair and members, that sort of triggers something for me from Member Hart's question too, is that when this bill was going through the process, and we were concerned, both at the board and at the department and elsewhere, that the dyslexia legislation would require a separate and additional screening that would not be able to be incorporated into the universal screener. And we communicated that concern to the legislature and to staff that this may be another screening that kiddos might have to come in and get a universal screening for reading and then a separate screener for all students for dyslexia, and that did not dissuade legislators from voting for that because they felt that it was so important. Now, luckily, Sean's been working with the vendors, and it will hopefully be incorporated into one, but I think that kind of goes to show that the threat of new assessments is not in and of itself a death knell at the legislature, at least in the last year, and that is maybe, although we're not asking for new assessment, maybe something that's helpful to us.
Member Yanis.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So a couple of kind of technical questions. So on the session law piece, so that's page 9, that is not for the implementation of the changes that we're making on page 4, correct? So that's not for the comprehensive assessment system. This is just additional administrative support. Okay. And then the second, and this is truly just something to perhaps think about. I think with the changes on page 4, this will be the first time in Title 15 I did a quick word search that we use the terms universal screener or benchmark tool. We use it all the time. I think everyone in this room understands what those things mean, but in terms of the statutory scheme, I don't believe it's in there. So something to think about is maybe whether or not you need a definition for those two terms. And those are my 2 questions.
Good point.
Sean, did you have anything? Okay. Anybody else? Member Wellborn?
I want to make sure I wait until everybody else has had their questions.
I know, I'm scanning from, I gotta.
Madam Chairman, I just wanted to make 2 other points regarding the funding part here. And one of the lessons we learned recently about funding is how difficult it is to assess the needs. So recently the legislature approved the additional $20 million for the safety program. And when I read a week ago that the request came in at $63 million? 97. Okay, so little underestimation of how much need and desire there is for the safety services. So even though we know we might not get what we ask, because that's just what happens, I do think some methodology around how we determine how much we ask for is appropriate. So when you come up with a number, whatever it is, there's some logic that says, well, we think there's so many schools that actually need a reading coach dedicated to them, and that would cost this. And then we say there's so many schools that probably can address their issues by going to additional training programs. So I think we need to have some good logic that identifies what we need. And the dyslexia effort legislation is a little bit of a lesson in that, because one of the things they've required is to make sure there's a dyslexia expert in every single school. So when you have methodology, you also sort of say, what are the minimum standards that a school that has high need? Is that, pull out groups of 10 kids based on their reading levels? I don't know, but I encourage you to go through that process of detailing what the need is, so we really think that we're asking enough to really get to the problem.
Madam Chair and Member Wellborn, absolutely, and that's one of the reasons why it's taken some more time. Budget development and justifications take some time, the methodologies you described, but absolutely, those are the things that we're working on.
Great recommendation. All right, and then I think, do you need anything else from us on this catcher, or do you have the notes that you need?
Madam Chair, members, no.
Are we approving this legislation then, or is that required, or what?
Madam Chair and members, it is Let me make sure. It is identified for possible action if the committee would like, but it's not required necessarily. Again, the committee already made these recommendations, and this is really the draft, and the committee has provided some good feedback for us to consider. And I actually, to Member Yanez's point, I was having a sidebar with Sean, and we both agree that defining those assessments is a very good idea, not only for statutory clarification, but also for every time Sean has to give a presentation about what the screener is and what it's used for and what the benchmark is and what it's used for, it'd be very nice to have that in statute. But having said that, not necessarily, no. Does it have to be approved?
So is there consensus on the committee in terms of which of the recommendations that were suggested by various members should be incorporated? Or is that for you to determine?
Madam Chair and Member Wellborn, those are things that if the committee would like to take up the question, certainly I don't, not one to preclude that from occurring. But we may also want to continue working on how those would look. And I would be hesitant because some of the recommendations were kind of not wordsmithing, but I would be hesitant to lock the committee into very specific recommendations that we weren't able to look at in advance and vet thoroughly, because I would hate to find something in between now and the board meeting that might be problematic and then put the board in a position of either accepting that recommendation that might be problematic or doing something that the committee didn't recommend.
Okay, I'm just confused because we've seen this legislation multiple times.
Yeah.
And my interest is that we move on. So can we, at least, except for maybe page 9 where you might actually be doing some more work, is there a point where we can say, okay, we've done our work on that and we can move on to some other things?
I think you can do we have consensus that taking all the feedback from the group and incorporating it as best you can based on the intent and the spirit of the original recommendations?
Yes.
Then I'm comfortable with you staff doing that and us not getting into the weeds, but I want to make sure the rest of the group is.
And Madam, yeah.
Does that work for you?
Yes.
Okay. So can I clarify?
Yeah.
So are we saying that all comments that were heard today will be incorporated into another draft and that will be the draft that is presented to the state board?
Madam Chair and Member Ref, sort of what I alluded to earlier, we will do the best that we can to incorporate them, yes, and to provide it to the board.
The statute language revisions.
Yes, yeah, that's what we're referring to. Yes.
And will we have an opportunity to see, when is the board meeting that this will be presented?
Madam Chair and Member Ref, it'll be October 28th, and the materials for that meeting is probably going to be distributed around this time next week.
So could we ask that when those materials are ready and before, can a copy be sent to this group so they know what's getting presented?
Yes,
Is that?
absolutely.
Yeah, I just, again, without consensus, it's important to me that I am on the record as not supporting this in its entirety.
Okay. Member Yanez.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I think it would be helpful to see exactly what the language looks like. If it's going to be given to the board in the form of a recommendation from this committee, I think in fairness to all of the committee members, we need to see it. And if it does require a vote, I mean, I would certainly be willing to get on the phone in a public way so that we can do that. But I think it would be cleaner, and I think it would be more fair, this is my personal opinion, to the committee members if we had an opportunity to do that.
Okay. Is that possible, Catcher, in the timeline that you have?
Your eloquence.
Yeah, that was very nice.
Madam Chair and members, if Alicia's watching, she might get upset at me if I commit to another meeting, an unscheduled meeting. Yes, it's certainly possible in the timeline, though it might be, a call-in. I mean, of course, a public meeting, but it might be more of a virtual meeting. But yes, that's something that we can make happen.
Okay.
And Madam Chair, if it is not, I mean, my thought would be that it not be presented as a firm recommendation of the committee, but something that was talked about and represented, and something that represents the conversation of the committee.
Right.
Because to me, it's very different to present a recommendation of the committee without a vote.
Right.
If it's just presented as information, with a summary
Where
of
the conversation is
that's
now.
a different story. Yeah.
Exactly. And is there a November, is there,
Our, Madam Chair, our meeting following that would be December, right now it's scheduled for December 2nd, but that's probably going to get moved to the subsequent week, which actually has implications for this committee's December meeting. So it's possible, you know, if depending on what we provide and if the board doesn't feel like it's ready yet, it's possible that it could get delayed until December. But, and Madam Chair, to Member Yanez's point, those, and I should have outlined that would have been the other option. Yeah.
okay. So you'll do your best to incorporate all feedback from today, and then you'll let us know if a virtual scheduled meeting is needed, or if you're just going to capture the conversation as it stands and not make it a recommendation from this task force yet, but just an update to the board on the conversation as it stands. Okay. Is everyone okay with that?
Yeah.
All right. And then you just heard Ketcher give us a heads up that to item number 4, that the December meeting of this group may also need to be rescheduled.
Yes. Yeah, Madam Chair and members, yes, and that's simply because it might come in conflict with our rescheduled December board meeting, which is still tentative, but that's something that might end up being on the radar, so we'll try to be in contact with you. In between now and then, though, we do have a November 14th Literacy Ad Hoc Committee meeting on the books right now.
Okay. All right, everyone. Well, thank you for your time today, and we are adjourned.